I'm Adam Reilly. Tonight on Greater Boston, Harvard protesters have voluntarily taken down their encampment on the school's yard. What does that mean for the pro-Palestine movement as the end of the school year draws closer? Plus, how much do you know about disability history? Easterseals, Massachusetts is pushing the state to require the community's story be taught in schools. A member from the group joins me to explain the importance. And then, taking the good with the bad at the MBTA as progress is made on repairs, but a huge budget shortfall looms. Bob C. joins me to break all of it down. 3 weeks after protesters first set up an encampment in Harvard Yard to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and to demand that the university divest from Israel, students voluntarily removed their tents today. Organizers agreed to take it all down after negotiations with university officials, who agreed on their part to meet with protesters to discuss the endowment and to quickly process petitions for suspended students to be reinstated. So what is next for Harvard and the student protest movement overall as the school year draws to a close? GBH News' Tori Bedford was there as protesters dismantled the encampment, and she joins me now. Hey, Tori. Hey. So the end of the encampment at Harvard was different than what we've seen at other institutions in the Boston area. Why do you think this particular encampment ended the way it did?
Well, it's interesting if you look at where these schools are located, right? Boston is such a college town, and we have all of these different campuses all across the city. But Emerson was one of the first ones to be cleared, and the police there actually read out the city ordinance, which bans tents, you know, and they were in kind of a public thoroughfare. They were on a city street. And so that was what was cited as the justification for bringing in police. And that one kind of stands out on its own in that way. Harvard, you know, MIT, all these other places, they're private camps, you know, I mean, private campuses, they have their own, you know, but Harvard Yard is also gated in. And what Harvard has been doing is checking IDs. You know, they can close and lock all of the gates and have security officers from the campus come out and check. And so I think that because they had that control and have maintained that control from the beginning, maybe that was a factor. I don't really know how each of these schools are making these decisions. Right.
We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but those are big differences that are worth highlighting. Is it also possible that Harvard was savvier, and I'm not saying that to endorse what they did, but just in terms of the efficacy of what they did, when it came to starting to mete out discipline in connection with the encampments, because they were suspending students, right? They were evicting them from student-owned housing, barring them from exams and commencement. And if I recall correctly, tell me if I'm wrong, they started doing that late last week, right?
These universities hire and are run by a lot of very savvy people, you know, well-educated, well-paid professionals. I'm thinking of Brown University, where students had declared victory, but what they won, you know, was that in October the board will vote on divestment, and they could still vote no. But that was the sort of concession that was made. Here there were some concessions that were made, and it's still not fully in agreement towards the divestment that students were asking for. I think you're talking about the suspensions. It's interesting because I'm not sure how they were going about, you know, figuring out who was involved in the encampment. Recently, we heard that a Harvard Crimson reporter, a student journalist, was issued a suspension that was immediately, you know, revoked. Right. But it kind of brings into question how they were determining who was a part of the protest and of the encampment. They were, you know, giving out, they have, I think, more than 20 students right now who have been suspended. The interim president, Alan Garber, just said that he would go back and reinstate those students and sort of take a step back on the other disciplinary actions that were sent out to the 60-some students.
Wrap them up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, but when you think about these universities kind of taking a step back and really figuring out how to make this work for them, it is a really, it's simple on one hand, but it's also very complex when you're thinking about managing an endowment and how those endowments might be indirectly invested in certain funds.
Well, that brings me to my next question, so nicely done. Anytime a guest does that, it's terrific. As you know, what are the concessions that the students got from the administration, and how might they affect this divestiture push moving forward?
So they agreed, the university agreed to meet with students and the shareholders who operate, the endowment. It's, I think, the biggest endowment, like university endowment in the country.
Yeah, it's more money than many countries, I believe.
Billion? I don't know.
It's in the billions.
Yeah, it's 50 billion.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
It's a lot of money.
And to kind of have discussions with students, those discussions will be student-led. So they'll get to come in and talk about why they should divest from XYZ. They'll also be talking about setting up a Center for Palestine Studies at the university.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's already been some funding set aside for that, so that was one of the concessions. And then, going and reinstating the students who were suspended and kind of looking at making sure that students are not facing specific disciplinary action for their involvement in the encampment.
I saw a Twitter thread from one of the groups that was involved with the encampment that kind of scoffed at these concessions that you just outlined, basically saying this is the administration just, trying to get us to pipe down and be quiet. We don't attach a ton of meaning to these things that they've offered us. Is that representative, or were there people who you spoke with who are pleased by these concessions?
Well, I think that's why I compared it to Brown, right? Because it's not the purpose, it's not the demands, right, that were met. I spoke to a student today who was suspended, so they asked to remain anonymous because they're afraid of future retaliation. Basically, it was saying that organizers at the encampment, they don't see it as a total win.
Okay, I think we've actually got video of the student who you spoke with, so let's take a look and hear it in her own voice.
All of these things, the campaign for divestment, the movement for Palestinian liberation, they didn't start with the encampment. They won't end with it. They certainly won't end with this deal. And we just have hope that, in addition to these conversations, kind of the community support and organizing power that we saw with this encampment will continue to put pressure on Garber to actually push the needle on divestment and disclosure.
That last comment of hers gets to a big question that I've got for you since you've been watching this stuff so closely. What's going to happen to this movement, not just at Harvard, but in the Boston area, across the country, now that the school year has wrapped up, because schools were so much epicenters of the protest movement? What do you foresee? I
actually asked that to a Northeastern student who told me that there are a lot of local students at the school, and he doesn't expect it to be, he said, I wouldn't expect a quiet summer. I think a lot of these discussions will be ongoing, and I think that when the students come back in the fall, particularly at universities like Harvard and Brown, where they have a promise, to meet with deans and heads of the school and people leading the endowment, I think that they plan to continue this push. At each individual encampment, they were all pushing for divestment, transparency, but that looks different in different places.
Right.
And so I think that this student who we just played the video was saying that, these are small wins in a way, and she said it pushes the needle. I do think that it is having an impact, around the world for people to see this. I think that it has put a lot of pressure on these institutions, which are extraordinarily powerful, and I don't know what we're going to see over the summer. I know a lot of kids will go home. A lot of people will be kind of figuring out how the school has disciplined. It's so different in each case at this point, based on the decisions that the school leaders have made. But I think that they are really radicalized about this, and a lot of them are 18, 19 years old, and so this is something that I think is really formative, right? This person is a social studies major and was saying this is, students have been criticized for saying, for going out and doing this instead of focusing on finals or focusing on their studies. And she was like, this is the work. This is what I am learning about.
And you mentioned people coming back in the fall, promises that have been made by institutions to engage in discussions, that sort of thing. Asking you to speculate here, but if the war in Gaza were to wrap up before then, would you anticipate this push would continue?
I think we've seen endowments at some universities, move away to divest from things like fossil fuels.
Yep.
And so looking at that history, there's a possibility that there will continue to be a push for some of these endowments, not to receive funding or to give funding or be involved so much and have these relationships with military institutions.
And as you mentioned, that is such a complicated thing, like the web of connections that might need to be untangled.
But it is possible, because some universities have done it when it comes to issues of climate change, which is also important to a lot of people of every generation, but particularly this generation who has been given this world that, is falling apart.
On that note, Tori Bedford, good to talk to you as always. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next up, there's been a lot of recent debate over how and what history should be taught in schools. But one group has been largely left out of that conversation, as well as the history books.
It's important to teach disability history so people know that we are human too and deserve the rights.
It's an often forgotten civil rights movement, and the more we forget about these types of movement, the more risk we are at having to fight them again.
That's why, as GBH News senior producer Meghan Smith reports, the state branch of the disability services nonprofit Easterseals is mounting a grassroots campaign to require Massachusetts schools to teach disability history. Meghan, who reports on disability stories for GBH News, joins me now along with Tatiana Thomas. She is a member of the Easterseals campaign. Thank you both for being here.
Hi, Adam.
So, Meghan, how did you find out about this story?
Yeah, so as you said, I've been reporting on disability for a few years. And last summer, I went to an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, celebration at City Hall in the city of Boston. And I met Tatiana and a few of her colleagues who were there to talk about their campaign to get more disability history taught. So that's where it started.
And my recollection, we were chatting before the show started, Tatiana, I think you said, was wearing some branded apparel, right?
Which she has now, yes.
And Tatiana, it says teach disability history on your sweatshirt.
That is correct. That's the name of what we do for Easterseals.
So, since you are part of the campaign,
Yes.
I'd love to know what prompted you to get involved with it.
So I wanted to get involved in the Teach Disability Histories because it's very important for education. A lot of people usually does not know what Teach Disability History is. There's a lot of important information there.
I'll confess, when I read the piece that you wrote about giving sort of a broad overview in the context of this push by Easterseals, I was a history major in college. I didn't learn anything
It's
about
amazing,
this.
right? How much we don't know and how much it intersects with so many other parts of history.
Yeah, it was actually kind of embarrassing, to be honest. So, Tatiana, I know that as you push to ramp up the teaching of disability history here in Massachusetts in public schools, you and your colleagues are going around giving presentations, right? What's the pitch that you make?
So we do presentations virtual and in person. So you can go on our website and request. So we also talk about, a lot of people usually does not know about the Inferno schools. The Inferno schools are still here. Those schools were for people with disabilities. The BCIL, the Easterseals are working together to talk to people that were in that concentration camp and to tell them why do we think it should be closed.
That was in Waltham, correct?
Yes.
And I think from the quiz that you put together on disability history, it was the first facility dedicated to purportedly caring for people with disabilities.
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts has a long history of these institutions. We were first, and they also stayed open the longest. So there's a lot of local history to dig into here. Yeah.
How do we compare to other states when it comes to the teaching of disability history?
Yeah, so there's a handful of states that do have laws in the books to require or mandate it in some way. And Massachusetts does designate October as Disability History Month in schools. And in 2018, the Massachusetts Department of Education did rehaul their standards to include some disability history. But a lot of people I talked to said teachers don't always know about this, and they have so much on their plate that they're not always able to take the time to integrate this if they want to.
And there's stuff that they can teach if they want to, curriculum support that's provided, but they have to opt in.
Yes.
Opt in, correct? Okay. I think we actually have a little bit from a documentary featuring, this is a documentary people can get from the state if they want, if educators want, featuring Judy Heumann. I will ask you to tell us a little more about Judy Heumann after we see this clip of her speaking.
Sounds good.
Disabled people feel that there is nothing else that we can do at this point but come to the streets and show the American public why we need their support and how we have a right to be able to work and raise families and get on and off the bus and on and off trains like everybody else. And that's what this is all about. We are members of society and we deserve the same rights.
Why should people know, or what should people know about Judy Heumann?
Yeah, I mean, one person I talked to said every American should know who Judy Heumann is. She's often called the mother of the disability rights movement. She came up as a teacher and later was an activist. She led protests, sit-ins, and her activism eventually led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And then she worked for the Clinton and Obama administration, and she passed away a year ago. And it sent a big shockwave through the disability community.
Tatiana, did you say when we were chatting before we started doing the show that you actually met her?
Some of our members on our Teach Disability History campaign got to meet her.
That's awesome, yeah.
When disability history is taught, we just talked about Judy Heumann, what are some other highlights, whether it's key individuals, pivotal moments, I think we might have seen one in that documentary, or sub-movements within the broader disability rights movement that people should learn about?
Yeah, I mean, the people I talked to said it really does go back to the founding of America, you know, the Civil War, disabled veterans.
Shell shock, right?
Yeah, the founding of the VA, eugenics, immigration. I really love how it intersects with the civil rights movement. Before the ADA was passed, there was a whole civil rights movement to get that passed. And there was a lot of active protests. For example, the 504 sit-in in the early 1970s, 100 people took over a federal building in San Francisco, which led to the enforcement of this act. And it was the largest takeover of a federal building in American history. And that's obviously, you know, relevant today with protests and everything going on. So I think there's a lot to learn from disability history.
Again, I sound like a broken record, but I was looking at these images and was blown away by all these seminal moments that I just didn't know about. And the fact that the ADA was only passed in 1990, which I should have remembered because I was alive then, graduating from high school, but I thought it was earlier.
It's not that old, and you know, a lot of people consider the ADA the floor. There's still a lot of activism going on, pushing for education, transportation, housing, and everything, so a lot to learn,
Tatiana, when you were a student in high school, you're a college student now, but when you were a student in high school, did you learn any of this history?
So I actually went to placement and outside placement, and no one taught us disability history for even schools that were trained for people with disabilities.
That's kind of remarkable. Why do you think it is important for everyone, whether it's people with disabilities, people who know people with disabilities, people who have no connection with the community, why is it important that this history be taught?
Disability history takes us a lot of different ways. Like, we first learn about Judy Heumann. There's also people like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman had a traumatic brain injury. A lot of people usually does not know the history of her. Helen Keller even was a teacher. She was blind. There's a lot of histories that is important, like the ADA, the 504 Act, the Capitol Call. There's so many important histories. We're trying to teach our students that we go out to present about disability histories. We have people that we know that are still fighting for disability history today.
Yeah, and you know, Adam, according to the CDC, 1 in 4 Americans have a disability of some kind. So that's a huge population that, you know, a lot of people say deserve to, you know, have their story told in history books. And, you know, some of the teachers I taught to said, learning this history can help people become advocates later. You know, it's Tatiana, she wants to be a disability advocate someday, and you're already working towards it. You know, learning that history of their own community can really help along that way.
Final question for you two. How much appetite does there seem to be when it comes to the people in power in Massachusetts for making the teaching of disability history something that is adding some teeth, making it mandatory in a way it isn't currently?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a small but growing movement. One person I talked to said it's overdue, and they're seeing more and more interest. I think, you know, ever since 2020, we've had a lot of conversations about diversity and equity in education. And I think a lot of disability advocates are hoping this could be part of that conversation. What are you seeing as you talk to people?
What we're seeing as Teach Disability, we have been seeing that a lot of schools has not been taught Teach Disability. We're the professionals. We know how it is. We actually, a bunch of us actually wrote to the legislators to make Massachusetts the Teach Disability History Month in October. And we have been talking to like different people. Alex Green from Harvard University, he has invited us. We've been there. We have been talking to different people about disability history all over. There's also a curriculum, California, that is making one about disability history.
Yeah, so there are things popping up here and there. There's also something called Reform to Equal Rights. That's another curriculum that was developed by a Western Mass organization. So there are resources out there for teachers that are interested.
It's really fascinating. I urge anyone who is interested in this, and I definitely am, look for Meghan's story on our website, gbhnews.org. Look for Meghan's quiz. And Tatiana, if people want to learn more about this campaign, what should they do?
So you are able to go to Easterseals Massachusetts website and go under Teach Disability History. There you would see the short video you saw, and you can request a presentation. Our youth director, Desi Forte, will email you guys, and you can request one.
Excellent. All right, Tatiana, Meghan, thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Finally, tonight, first the good news. Some desperately needed repairs to the state's transit system are either completed or on pace to finish ahead of schedule. But there's also some bad news coming down the tracks, specifically regarding where the T is going to get the money it needs to keep running in the years to come. Here to break down what it all could mean for your commute is GBH News transportation reporter Bob C. Bob, good to see you, as always. You actually have a little bit of breaking news before we get to the glass half full, glass half empty stuff that I mentioned. What is this breaking news that you've brought into the studio with you?
Well, our colleagues at WNYC in New York have published a story that Richard Davey, who used to be the general manager of the MBTA years ago and for the past 2 years has headed up the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York, has made a decision to come to Boston and head Massport. We can't get any confirmation of that from Massport at all. They say they're still interviewing finalists. They haven't made a decision. But apparently, Transit Workers Union president in New York has confirmed that he says that it's up to Davey to simply accept the job.
So it sounds like it's reached a point where even though it's not officially confirmed, we can take it on good authority that it's happening. Just really quickly, what's Davey's rep in the world of transit?
I think it's very good. I mean, he did a fairly good job at the MBTA, and then when he took over in New York, he had to take over after COVID, and he really built up the ridership to almost pre-COVID levels.
Yeah, I remember seeing those numbers. That they were getting better.
But he has been beset with a lot of problems. Congestion pricing is a big issue in New York. There's also been violence. Remember, the National Guard was called out. So there are a lot of big challenges in New York City, but he there has been credited with doing a good job.
All right, on to the good news. We'll emphasize the positive to start out. There's good news involving the subways here in the Boston area. What is it?
Well, as we know, we're involved in a year-long effort to eliminate all the slow zones on all the subway lines. There were more than 200 when we began. And just recently, work on the Red Line has eliminated another 13 very critical speed restrictions in the downtown core area between Park Street and JFK UMass. And I've heard from some riders and seen on Twitter, people are like, wow, the subways are actually moving like subways should. And it's been such a long time, and people have had to deal with these slow zones for such a long time. It's evidence that Phil Eng, the general manager's plan of fixing these slow zones, is working. And he really needs some small successes here to build up his credibility as he moves through the year.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything that he can point to that's been achieved gives people more patience, more confidence that he'll be able to get more stuff done. And the Blue Line, did you tell me when we were talking earlier, all the slow zones are gone?
Yes, last month. That was all, they were all eliminated. And so his plan appears to be working. And the only complaint I've heard is about the shuttle buses, which they have to employ to, and apparently during the Red Line diversion, as they call it, the shuttle buses were problematic.
Yeah, no one, you're never going to win with the shuttle bus. Right? It's like the transit equivalent of a substitute teacher. Everyone gives it a hard time. No one likes it.
People were willing to endure it as long as they could see some.
No offense to substitute teachers out there who may be watching. All right, the Sumner Tunnel. Good news there as well after that very disruptive shutdown last summer. Why are people maybe going to be pleased with how things go this time around?
Well, instead of another 2-month-long shutdown for July and August, they've limited it now to just July. And they're able to do that by doing a lot of extra work on the weekend closures that we had this past year. So much so that they really feel confident that they can remain closed for just 1 month. And of course, August, it gets much busier with college students returning and everything. So it's sort of critical for them to get it done by then. So people using the Sumner will have to endure just 1 month instead of 2 this year.
That's great.
Yeah.
What needs to be done in the Sumner? What's on tap for that month?
Well, last year it was the ceiling and the arches. This year it's the roadway itself that's being rebuilt.
Okay. And once that month of work is completed, there's still going to be more work left to be done, but it's going to be done on evenings and weekends, right?
Yes, that's true.
Okay. Which, again, significantly less disruptive than just the complete shutdown. All right. I want to talk to you about what's going on with the state's Transportation Funding Task Force, chaired by Monica Tibbetts-Nutt, the Secretary of Transportation, who got in hot water fairly recently for some comments she made speaking to an advocacy group. We can take a look at some of what she had to say and then double back.
I'm going to talk about tolling. I'm going to talk about charging T&Cs more. I'm going to talk about potentially charging more for package deliveries, charging more for payroll tax, basically going after everybody who has money. And when I'm talking tolling, I'm talking at the borders.
So after that, Governor Healey distanced herself from those comments. There was a big maelstrom in conservative media in particular. Now the mandate of the task force that she heads that's supposed to come up with funding solutions for transit in the state, the mandate has been significantly weakened, right?
Yeah, I think it has, and people I've talked to say it's a bit of a retreat, because this task force was to come up with some definite recommendations by the end of this year. And the funding of the transportation system is perhaps the most important, critical issue that the legislature and all of us face, is how we're going to keep this transportation system going. And tolling, or if you want to call it that, or road pricing, would have been one of the major components of solving that problem, whether people like to hear it or not. It's considered to be one of the fairer ways of doing it. And so what we heard after Secretary Tibbetts' comment was, it's been taken off the table by Governor Healey. Well, that's quite a blow for a lot of people who really were looking to at least examine it, and I think it still will be examined in some form.
And tolling's been taken off the table by the governor, who's distanced herself again very quickly from Monica Tibbetts' comments. But also, this task force is no longer presenting suggestions that have the weight of the governor behind them, right? They're presenting, what did you say the term is, a roadmap or a toolkit?
A toolkit. They're going to come up with several options that somebody else can make a decision about.
If they,
And so it's a really can being kicked down the road big time, I think, and it sets us back, I think, several months. We don't have a lot of time to solve this funding problem.
Just to drive home the funding problem that you're talking about, just to emphasize the magnitude of it, we've got a graph here, which I'm hoping we can pull up. The big numbers are at the bottom. It identifies, total revenue projected to come into the T in the coming years, total expenses. The revenue is the moderately light bar. The revenue is the expenses are the dark bar. And you can see there, if you peek down at the bottom, that when we look ahead to fiscal year 2029, we're looking at $863 million worth of a deficit.
Yes. Yeah,
it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And we're going to start hitting it in fiscal 26, which begins next July 1st, when really the MBTA has sort of emptied out all the spare change it has to meet that next year's budget deficit. They can do that. But after that, they're on their own, and we're on our own in terms of coming up with some kind of solution. And there has to be a solution. So it's going to be very difficult for this task force, and I think for politicians in general to see this through.
Huge problem. It will be fascinating to see how they try to solve
Lots
it.
of politics.
Bob C., really good to talk to you about this, as always. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.
That's it for tonight, but do come back tomorrow. Thousands of local newspapers have closed across the country. So how can we keep local journalism alive? Two industry veterans join me to talk about their new book that aims to help media startups find their niche. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Who is this guy?